start, Fred.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's Fred Volkmar. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this month's December's Science of Autism meeting from the Autism Center of Excellence here at Southern Connecticut State University. And we do this in conjunction with the Yale Center of Excellence and Autism as well. And before I introduce our speaker, Giacomo, this morning, I just want to remind people next month, Brian Reichow from the University of Florida is giving a talk on evidence-based treatments in autism. This is a fascinating area. 20 years ago, when the National Research Council did its very influential report on educating children with autism, all it took was one published study in a peer-reviewed journal to be regarded as evidence-based. These days, there are many more bells and whistles. And the amazing thing is people have been able to live past those bells and whistles. And Brian's going to be talking about what it now takes to be regarded as evidence-based and what some of those treatments are. That being said, I'm very pleased this morning to introduce my former student friend and colleague, now Giacomo Vanti, who's a tenured professor at Drexel's Autism Institute. Giacomo is an old friend of mine, translated one of my early books into Italian. I can recall meeting him in Italy, and he and Ami Klein and I walked around together, and he kept talking about the difficulties of translation of things that didn't even exist in Italy, as I recall. And we had a great time. He came over and spent some time at Yale. Then he did his PhD with Sally Rogers. Then he moved to Australia and did some work with the Sally Rogers early start model. And he's now back at Drexel and so doing some very interesting stuff, including international outreach. So, and he's also an associate editor of the Journal of Autism, which I edit. So I'm very pleased to have Giacomo this morning. Giacomo is going to be talking about some of the international global perspectives on autism. And Giacomo, take it away.
Thank you so much, Fred. It is a tremendous privilege to be invited to give a talk as part of this Science of Autism initiative. I'm so grateful to Fred, not only because he introduced me to the science of autism, but also he introduced me to seeing autism from the lens of different perspectives. When I moved to Connecticut back in 2003, almost 20 years ago, that was my first exposure to autism being seen by a different culture that was not my culture. I'm originally from Italy. And I'm glad that happened. So today I'm going to talk about some of the work that it's been going on autism, examining how different approaches exist when we look at autism through the lens of different geographical and different cultural contexts. And first of all, I want to mention the research group I'm part of at the A.J. Drexel Autism Institute here in Philadelphia. You see here the director of our institute, Professor Diana Robbins, who I also met at Yale 20 years ago when I was visiting Fred. So let's start by saying that, yes, autism is a global phenomenon. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience learning about autism in Italy, where I'm from, and then working as a clinician and as a researcher in different geographical contexts, including Australia and the United States, and visiting more than 20 countries across all continents through various projects that were attempting to disseminate knowledge on autism and especially on early intervention in contexts that were very different from the context where those interventions were originally designed, and the challenges and the opportunities that come from this kind of research. So by now there is consensus that autism exists everywhere in the world, There's an estimated 52 million people with a diagnosis of autism globally. And in the past 20 years, but especially in the past decade, we have witnessed an increased awareness of autism spectrum disorder in low income and middle income countries. And this is partly due to the fact that declines in mortality among children under 5 has resulted in more children with developmental delays. They became more visible, including autism. One important notion is that while awareness is definitely increased, and you can tell that by the number of advocacy groups, mostly parents, caregivers associations, they're everywhere in the world now. However, child health programs and services in low income and middle income countries are still mostly focused on life-threatening issues with more limited attention to developmental disabilities. And this is a dynamic we often observe when we're trying to make the point that services for autism spectrum disorder are needed. They're important for the well-being of those with autism, their families, and the community, even if autism in itself is not a life-threatening issue. So when we think about autism as a global phenomenon, we have little evidence that ethnic, cultural, or socioeconomic factors affect the prevalence of autism when we take into account all confounding factors. We certainly do not understand autism as a first world problem. Autism is not only present in different geographical contexts, in all geographical contexts we're aware of. It's also present across cultural contexts within countries. As you probably know, when Leo Kanner first started trying to understand the nature of autism in the 1940s, one of the sort of misleading ideas that he advanced was the idea that autism had to do with parents being rich, having a lot of money and resources, and perhaps prioritizing engagement in profitable activities such as, or their career at the expense of caregiving, basically. That was definitely not the case. Autism is not about a response to a cold environment that prioritizes profit or that prioritizes career building or anything like that. So we can certainly exclude that autism is something that takes place in rich countries where family is not being the center of people's attention. Not only, so we believe that the prevalence of autism, when all confounding factors are taken into account, will be the same in different countries. There's also no compelling evidence of different phenotypes in different countries at this point, meaning the way when people talk about autism and the presentation, the clinical presentation, the two clusters of social communication difficulties and sort of behavioral flexibility and restricted repetitive behaviors. This is what we see in descriptions of autism, and what I saw seeing kids with autism in 20 plus countries. The clinical presentation of autism resembles the description of Leo Kanner and what we consider to be the manifestation of autism. However, there is a disproportionate amount of severe cases in low and middle income countries. And that poses a little bit of a puzzle. And while we don't have a consensus on why that might be the case, we have some hypotheses. So one hypothesis is that there is a more limited appreciation of the milder end of the spectrum So they might not be diagnosed. So children who have language, for example, or do not present with severe behaviors, such as aggression or self-injurious behavior, might just not be diagnosed because their differences or their atypical behaviors are not considered concerning enough to justify a diagnosis. So that will make sense in the context of the fact that a more limited appreciation of the milder end of the spectrum was also something that occurred historically in Western countries. So that's one possibility. We also need to think about the context in which social challenges become apparent. You know, one thing that you find in the DSM-5 definition of autism is that symptoms usually will be observable during early development, the first 3 years of life, or they might become apparent only when social demands, like going to school, create a context where those social difficulties are observable, are apparent. So in this context, we also need to think about the social demands that are posed by different geographical and cultural contexts. For example, in Western countries, there is a lot of emphasis on being socially extroverted or taking part in cooperative activities, or we have a lot of narratives about leading, for example, social groups and all of that. Those kind of challenges that require children to use their social skills very frequently might not always be prevalent or relevant across all geographical and cultural contexts. So we need to take into account when is it that something becomes, when is it that a difference, that an expression of atypical behavior becomes relevant enough to justify the idea that there's an impairment there, and that will be different in different contexts. There's another component, and those two are not mutually exclusive explanations, which is that the idea that comorbidities and secondary disabilities, such as, for example, anxiety, which might cause social withdrawal, may emerge as a result of fewer services, inadequate care, more stigma, which might be present across different geographical and cultural contexts, and isolation, such as not having a context where the idea of responding to the child's difficulties is to try to teach them, for example, the skills that the child has difficulties with, which can cause isolation, which can exacerbate initial difficulties, ultimately resulting in a more severe presentation. I must emphasize that a lot of the challenges that I'm describing in the context of low and middle income countries are the same that we experience here in the United States in specific geographical context and cultural context within the United States. So in response to inadequate care, stigma, and isolation, we would expect to see comorbidities such as anxiety and depression, even suicide, and exacerbation of social symptoms or even repetitive behavior, something that children might engage with if they have fewer educational opportunities, fewer social opportunities, less engagement in any activity that is being deliberately designed to stimulate their skills. Now, autism is a global phenomenon, but autism research is not a global phenomenon. In fact, most knowledge on autism and autism treatment is based on research that was conducted here in the United States and a few other countries that we usually Western countries, but really a handful of countries will make the majority of countries where published research is from. Although this trend is changing a little bit, there's an increasing amount of research that comes from other countries. So here's the thing, most knowledge comes from research conducted in Western countries, but most individuals with autism do not live in Western countries. The estimate is 90% plus of individuals with autism come from countries that did not contribute a substantial body of knowledge on autism. So why would that be a problem? Of course, one can say, well, that's not really a problem. We're going to do research where we have the resources to do research and disseminate the findings in all other countries. So it's just a matter of translating tools, making things accessible. It's more complicated than that. First issue, relevance of the findings from Western countries cannot be assumed that, for example, if we find specific genes that are associated with some autism symptoms in a US or British or Canadian sample, those same genes are associated with autism symptoms necessarily with the same relevance in other countries. Having samples that encompass multiple geographical and cultural contexts will make it much easier and to make that assumption or to make that inference. This finding is relevant, not just for the sample that we used. Another important component is child rearing practices. I'll go back to it, but the idea, for example, that certain caregivers' behaviors will facilitate aspects of developmental trajectories. For example, there's research in the US and in Europe showing that parents' use of following in sentences, like the child says something and the parent repeating what the child is saying while adding one element. So basically following the child's lead and expanding on what the child is saying, that has been associated with vocabulary development. However, this particular behavior that we see in parents, repeating something that the child is saying and expanding it, is not necessarily a universal practice. It's not a universal child rearing practice. So we need to take into account when we're thinking about, oh, well, this is a very relevant finding, I'm going to disseminate this knowledge, that the cultural context where we are might be more or less able to even understand what we're talking about or to relate those findings to something that can be done, that can be implemented. Another issue is the relevance of tools that we use. For example, the gold standard tool in the Western world for diagnosis is the ADOS. The ADOS is, of course, Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. You interact with the child and you see whether the child is responding to your initiations or take the initiative in terms of social communication and so on across certain activities. And some of those activities, like, for example, participating to a pretend birthday party scenario, are highly culturally biased, meaning that the knowledge of what to do in a birthday party that has candles and all of that is certainly not reflecting a universal practice. Just like the idea that children will initiate with adults if the adults stop initiating with them is not necessarily something that can be expected across geographical and cultural contexts. As I will mention later, starting a conversation or initiating with an adult or even pointing to an adult is not something that is actively encouraged in many cultures. Another issue, this is a question mark, is whether there are cultural differences in the expression, so that the use of Western-based tools like the ADOS perpetuates and reinforces the idea of autism as the constellation of manifestations that we originally saw in the Western world. Basically, the idea that our tools are confirming autism only when autism manifests itself in the way that was described in the Western countries, and as a consequence, we will not diagnose children whose autism might exist but is manifested differently. Again, there's very little research, and it's very hard to do this kind of research on autism expressing itself in different ways, because ultimately we diagnose autism based on a behavioral description. And so if the behavior of a child does not match the behavioral criteria that we call autism, then we cannot call that different manifestation necessarily autism in the absence of a biological sort of signature. There are also cultural differences in the perception of strength and needs, what is considered to be a strength and what is considered to be an area requiring some kind of intervention. This is particularly important in the context, for example, of doing things like engaging in pretend play, like playing with a doll. When I was working in Italy and I was asking parents of boys who came to see me because they thought their child might have autism, the child not playing with a doll or not engaging in pretend play could be seen as a strength, because playing with a doll was considered to be not a masculine thing that a boy should do, and in fact it could have been discouraged. Similar with not communicating and just, for example, getting the orange juice by themselves as opposed to requesting it or to asking for it. So when I talk with parents, I need to know where parents are from before I can figure out what are they considering to be a problem and what are they considering to be actually something that might be even socially desirable, some expressions of early emerging masculinity that have to do with maybe less empathy, more goal-directed behaviors that do not involve social interactions and so on. These are all considerations. Again, I'm not trying to stereotype specific ethnic groups or countries, but what I'm saying is that when we use tools that were created, including the questions that we're asking in a specific geographical or cultural context, we need to think whether the perception of those behaviors that we're talking about, does the child help other children, for example, does the child respond when another child is crying or so on, are considered to be desirable, relevant, something that will be on the radar of parents. We need to think about the impact of stigma, governance, and resources when we're thinking about the impact of research on the impact of the lack of research in different countries. So what can happen is that simply, even if I have the best research finding and I'm ready to disseminate that finding in a different country, for example, the finding that parents might benefit from parent coaching that facilitates synchronicity or sensitivity and responsivity to their child, to the child's behavior. Professionals in that country might feel that finding is not that relevant because the stigma of even calling that child autistic is so much that will prevent parents from engaging in any search for help, or that the way services are organized makes it so unlikely that the child, that that you can incorporate that practice into a service, that you might as well not even disseminate that finding, or that the resources are just not sufficient. So you talk about your research finding in the country where they invite you, and then they say, oh, this is cool, but we don't have the resources to do this. It's too expensive, it's too labor intensive. We don't have the capacity. Is going to make people even more depressed because you diagnose their child with autism. You say there are treatments out there that work, but we cannot do them because we don't have the tools, we don't have the resources. So that's a big obstacle. And implementation of diagnosis and intervention programs across geographically diverse systems is a problem, because we can talk about how an intervention is particularly effective when delivered by a behavior analyst, for example, or a behavior therapist, as part of a team with a speech and language pathologist and an occupational therapist, but we might be working in a system where those professional figures are just not there. And there might be completely different professional figures, including coming from disciplines that are hostile to those approaches. Like in my country, when I grew up in the 1990s, most people working directly with children with autism were coming from a background of psychoanalytic or psychodynamic psychology, which was traditionally, still is traditionally, considered to be incompatible with the views and the approaches of applied behavior analysis. So here I'm not talking about low-income countries, I'm talking about France, I'm talking about Italy, I'm talking about many areas in Latin America and Eastern Europe. So there are consequences for those with autism. It's not just the frustration for me, doing my research and not being able to disseminate the knowledge that come from that research everywhere. It is difficult for, if you don't do research in a country, it's more difficult to draw policymaker attention and public resources to autism. Services are more likely to be there when there is a conversation about autism, when there is knowledge about autism, and when there is expertise. So if you don't do research, you also don't have a tool to develop that sort of expertise. I talked about the issues with validity, utility, and accessibility of gold standard diagnostic and assessment tools, but these also expand to evidence-based intervention. The less research there is in a country, the less we know whether those tools are helpful, valid, usable, which might lead people to not even trying to adapt them or to translate them. A big issue with not having research or university-based research program is the shortage of experienced professionals, regardless of the discipline. People who have been used to, who've been exposed to knowledge about autism. And resistance to adoption of evidence-based practices, even when accessible, when those practices are accessible, due to culturally and geographically specific, let's call them cultural hegemonies in different professional circles. Let me give you an example that comes from my own experience in Italy. So in this picture, you see my two brothers, Giulio and Michele, who were diagnosed with autism in the late 80s in Italy. And back then, they were diagnosed, and my mother was told, your children have autism because you are a medical doctor, and you sort of prioritized your career over spending time with your children. So the treatment for the autism of your children is going to be psychotherapy for you. And, my mother, being open-minded, said, okay, well, if it's my fault, at least it's something we can fix. Sure, psychotherapy for me, but what about my children? Is there treatment for them? So they said no, because if you change the way you approach your children and your priorities in life, they're going to do better. So the fact is that conversation took place at the time where, in fact, research knowledge on helpful treatment was already accessible. And indeed, also the knowledge that parents were not the cause of their children's autism was already accessible. So it was not, and translated into Italian, that was not a problem of access. That was a problem of specific professional circles. In this case, psychiatrists and psychologists in Italy being trained in thinking about autism from a psychoanalytic perspective, including the idea that autism was caused by parents, and a very active resistance on any intervention that was based on applied behavior analysis. So that was not about, I don't know that ABA exists. That was about ABA is evil, is coming from this Anglo-Saxon culture that is pushing certain ideas about psychology that are inconsistent with what I was trained on. Now, there were turning points, and I'm going to talk about some turning points that I witnessed in different countries that changed cultural approaches and ultimately allowed for dissemination of knowledge in a way that affected children with autism in a positive way. The first time I actually saw Fred Volkmar was in 1998. And that was a conference in Italy, a large autism conference. And that was a historical moment in shaping the culture of autism in Italy, because the Italian organizer of the conference invited Professor Donald Cohen, who you see here in this picture, who was the director of the Yale Child Study Center. And Professor Donald Cohen asked something to the Italian organizer. He asked, will there be any parent, caregiver, advocate talking, or is just going to be professional? And the Italian organizer initially said, well, it's only going to be professionals. We're going to talk about parents. We're not going to listen to parents. We're going to talk about them. So we don't want them to be there. It's going to make the conversation more uncomfortable. And Donald Cohen said, we need to have parents there. They need to talk. We need their voices need to be heard, needs to be heard. And that's why my mother and myself were invited at the time. My mother gave a talk at that conference, and it was one of the first time in Italy someone from a parental association was talking at a conference where professionals were usually talking about parents without parents. That was definitely a turning point, because that became the rule from that conference, really. That was a while ago. More recently, I witnessed a historical change in culture in a region of the world that you might not be familiar with, because it's quite remote, Bhutan. In 2017, the Queen of Bhutan, you see her here, and the King of Bhutan acknowledged that autism existed in Bhutan for the first time. And that knowledge was made possible through a connection between the royal family in Bhutan and the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, who you see here. That was a historical moment because it generated allocation of resources, and the first, one of the first manifestations of this turning point was a very large conference, which was the largest conference, international conference at that time in Bhutan, that I was honored to be part of, where the concepts of autism intervention were introduced in the region. So things are changing, and they do not necessarily change in a linear way. Often is through some sort of turning point, and that's important to think about when we're thinking about taking action that can make a difference. Okay, So we have avenues to increase awareness, but that's not enough. Even when we have awareness, even when we have access, and even when we have people on board, no resistance to Western sort of concepts, you still have a problem. And that problem is what I call the implementation dilemma. So the implementation dilemma is that the first thing that we are asked when we talk about evidence-based intervention in different countries is to make those interventions more affordable. How do you make interventions more affordable? By reducing training requirements. Less, skilled professional being involved. And so we know that making intervention more affordable by reducing training requirements will facilitate acceptability and feasibility, especially in chronically under-resourced communities. However, there is also evidence that lower fidelity, lower integrity, lower adherence to protocols, and poorer and will lead to poor intervention outcomes. And this is particularly the case when interventions are delegated to non-specialized workers. So that leads to a phenomenon whereby less expensive interventions that do not meet the recommended standards are routinely implemented because of the argument that provision of intervention to any standard is preferable to not delivering any intervention. However, that can also perpetuate a cycle that provides an excuse for public agencies to not mobilize the resources that are needed to do the intervention properly. So if you have the argument that half an hour of treatment every 2 weeks is better than nothing, it comes with pros and cons, including the idea that governments might say we are doing something, we do have the resources, but outcomes are not the same than doing the same intervention to a higher standard. And we need to keep thinking about how to address this dilemma. Another dilemma comes from the old parent coaching sort of narrative that we have in Western countries. A lot of our what we call evidence-based early interventions, particularly the ones that have parent coaching component, rely on what we call joint activity routines, and those are social emotional sort of dyadic exchanges during peekaboo routines, face-to-face interactions, tickle games, and all of that often take place during time where the parent is deliberately devoting some time to do one-to-one routine with the child. And now these routines might actually be the expression of Western child rearing and educational practices. Sensitive responsiveness in child caregiving might be manifested differently in different cultures. There are a lot of literature on cultures whereby parents are always very quick in responding to signals of distress from their children, but not necessarily engaging them in this kind of routines when children are not in distress, quite simply because they are busy doing other things that are related to the immediate survival of the child and the family. So that has important implications on what we ask caregivers to do and what we expect caregivers to do. I'm gonna skip the slide because I want to talk about a little bit of the priorities and solutions, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. But we need broader populations to be included in autism research, including samples from low and middle income countries, but also more representation of diversity within high income countries. We also need research to be conducted locally by scientists from low and middle income countries, because they're more likely to ask the right questions to formulate and evaluate programs that can be feasibly implemented locally. That might be an easier path than trying to adapt something that was conceptualized and operationalized in a country with a completely different system of governance and services and different cultural practices around education. Now, the main issue is methodological rigor and research training. It's not enough to tell my colleagues in Bhutan or in Tibet, do your research locally if there is no infrastructure that facilitates the kind of rigorous research that we need in order to make an inference on the validity of the findings and the effectiveness of the programs being tested. So we need to make those inferences. So one thing that I did with my colleagues as part of the early career committee of the International Society for Autism Research, we launched an initiative back in 2018 called the Early Career Global Representative Initiative Pilot, or GRIP. And the idea was to expand and support the involvement of early career researchers from diverse geographical backgrounds and location. And so basically we asked people who are at the early stages of their career to become the point of reference for early career researchers from the same countries and liaise directly with us. INSAR, again, we are the International Society for Autism Research Early Career Committee, so that we could understand better the needs of people of early career researchers in different geographical contexts, and make sure that initiatives and everything that happens in this International Society for Autism Research conference was also responsive and relevant to the needs of diverse geographical contexts, not just Western countries. We also launched a mentoring initiative, which was a tiered mentorship program where early career researchers from diverse geographical contexts could get mentorship online from senior established researchers to facilitate, again, capacity building in research, in early career research. At this point, we have 6 members in Australia, China, Denmark, India, South Africa, and Taiwan, who are part of this initiative. They have their own networks, and they liaise with us, and they create initiatives that are designed to expand international representation of early career researchers, identify and address the needs of these researchers from geographical diverse backgrounds, and facilitate international networking, local capacity building, and regional expertise. We saw a lot of initial change after we introduced these, even if it's only 6 of them at this point, including a lot of virtual meetings with local members from specific geographical contexts, with senior mentors, setting up of early career networks within each country or regions, and so on. So we're pretty excited about this, although it's just a drop in the ocean. I'm going to share some data from the work that I did mentoring one person who was involved in this mentoring program. Her name is Paulina Buffel, and she's in Ecuador, and she's conducting research trying to understand practices related to autism in Ecuador, as well as perception of needs and in that region. And as you can see from this data that we presented at INSAR, she conducted a survey on 153 medical doctors on whether or not they used screening specific for ASD. We have screening tools that have important limitations, but can be feasibly implemented, and they're translated in Spanish. And as you can see, most medical doctors said, we do not use that because we don't have time, or we're not sure how to use them, or we don't know when to use them, or we don't know what to do next. So all of these are barriers that can lead to local action once we know what the local barriers are. Additionally, the majority of medical doctors felt that they were not confident, they did not feel comfortable discussing early warning with parents, even if early warnings were detected, because of the stigma associated with autism. So even when they will implement those early screenings, then the next step was not to talk about it with parents, because in most cases they were concerned about alarming parents. And Paulina also conducted a survey on the general population in Ecuador, and found that on most participants, these are people who are not health professionals, but in response to specific behaviors which reflect symptoms of autism, they were asked whether they would consider that to be concerning or requiring some kind of intervention. And most participants did not endorse social communicative difficulties as concerning. Only language impairments, only the absence of language and self-injurious behavior were endorsed as concerning by more than half of the respondents. And only language impairment was identified as having its origin in a developmental disorder. Most respondents attributed the causes of autistic behavior to factors unrelated to autism, such as the child personality, or in some cases, supernatural explanations. So this is just a glimpse of the kind of research that is going on and that can help acting locally in a way that might be complementary to the simple translation and dissemination of protocols and findings from Western countries to other countries. So a little summary and conclusions. The vast majority of individuals with autism in the world today live in low and middle income countries, but these countries have been largely unrepresented in autism research. This is a problem for all, not just for individuals who live in this country, because our knowledge of autism is incomplete and may be biased, only being based on a very selected geographical location or geographical locations. Dissemination of research conducted in high-income countries is great. It needs to happen, but it's not sufficient. We also need rigorous research that takes place in low and middle-income countries, and that needs to be conducted by researchers locally. So we need to think very hard, not just how to adapt things to other countries, but how to build capacity. Fred is doing a major job with that by really thinking about the Journal of Autism as an international journal and encouraging research from everywhere in the world. But this process is just in its infancy. So we need to put more effort for a more culturally diverse and geographically diverse representation of autism research. So I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention. And I'll be happy to address any questions if there's any question.
Giacomo, we've had one question come in. I don't know if you can see it in the chat.
Yeah, wait, yeah, 1 second. Yep, so one question is, I would appreciate your guidance on procedures to make a remote evaluation possible. Shall we send therapy videos first or specific instruction before we can do supervision in remote? This is someone who is contacting me from Italy. So it's complicated. So a lot of my colleagues will say, nothing replaces the hands-on work and interacting with children in person. And so they will discourage people from other countries, basically sending videos or using that as a platform to make, for diagnosis or evaluations or even coaching. I think this is changing. People are realizing that there has to be some sort of compromise where not everything can be the specialist meeting the person in person. But there are things you can do, and I'm happy to link with you directly if you want to send me an email to think about the specifics. It really depends on what you want to do. Diagnosing children remotely is complicated. Maybe Fred can comment on that, because I'm sure he also gets a lot of questions about that. But I would say it really depends on whether you want to go with something is better than nothing idea, or you want to stick with this is the protocol and that's all you can do. Yeah, also in terms of work on diagnosis within US in minority groups. Now, this is interesting. A lot of the challenges that we see in low and middle income countries are similar to the challenges experienced by minoritized groups. One example, the disproportionate amount of severe autism that I talked about. Well, that seems to be the same in certain ethnic groups where we see the presentation of autism and we see more intellectual disability, and we see more comorbidities, for example. Now, the reason is not, likely the reason is not that there is something different about the biology of autism in different minority groups, but it is more that access to services is more complicated, is more challenging, or there is initial data suggesting that, for example, pediatricians or health professionals might be less inclined to respond to a concern if that concern comes from someone who is from a minority background. For example, my child doesn't respond when I call him. My child doesn't initiate. That concern that the parent is reporting might be responded to differently depending on the minority status of families. That will lead to delayed access to services, less treatment, ultimately leading to exacerbation of autism symptoms. Ultimately, we can change that if we are taking into account, again, the context. When I'm asking these parents, do you see anything concerning about your child? I need to make sure that I am thinking about what will be considered to be concerning, what could be happening there, for example, within minority groups where there is a high level of stigma related to autism. I might need a follow-up question. I might need to push a little bit more to figure out whether there's something concerning there, because there might be some resistance. It might be a very different conversation for someone who's seeking for intervention versus someone who is resistant to the idea of intervention because they might have the idea that intervention was designed to, by people who might not have their best interests at heart. I saw a question from a colleague in Brazil who were asking about parent training and the feasibility of online parent training. So again, it's a little bit of a dilemma where in one hand, online is not ideal because it does not capture the entire experience that you will have while being in someone's home. It comes with problems around equity because not everybody has access to online platform, although it's changing. But overall, I will say, yes, it is feasible to talk with a parent, ask what are they currently doing to facilitate the child's learning and development, and then starting from there. again, I will think about building capacity locally so that it's not someone, so I wouldn't want someone who knows nothing about Brazilian educational practices or child rearing, perspectives to start telling a parent, do this and do that, because then we have a problem of acceptability or fit. If the parent feels like they're asking to do something that doesn't come natural to them, then that might fail for a reason, even if the practices being used are in itself evidence-based. So again, we need to facilitate local capacity building.
Great job. Thank you, Giacomo.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for attending. Have a merry holiday. Thanks again to our speaker. Giacomo did a wonderful job, and we'll see you next month for evidence-based treatments. Thanks, everyone. Giacomo, thanks. This was a great talk.
Thank you, Fred. That was a tremendous, tremendous privilege to be part of this.
Oh, that's great. And say happy holidays to your wife and daughter.
I will. Same to your family.
Okay,
Bye.
thanks. See you.